It's December 1941. The Pacific is on fire. But what most people don't know is that Pearl Harbor wasn't supposed to be the end. It was supposed to be the beginning, because deep inside Tokyo's naval war rooms, there was another plan, one so bold, so insane, that even Japan's own admirals hesitated to speak it out loud. A plan not just to strike America, but to invade it. You heard that right. The Empire of Japan, at the height of its power, fresh off the greatest naval ambush in history, had drawn up blueprints to bring the war directly to U.S. soil, to plant their flag on the very beaches of the American West Coast. But here's the crazy part. It almost happened. See, the textbooks like to wrap Pearl Harbor up in one clean story. Japan attacked. America woke up. The rest is history. But that's just the movie version. The truth? Pearl Harbor was meant to cripple America long enough for Japan to take the Pacific, Hawaii, Alaska, the Philippines, and maybe even California. It wasn't a single strike. It was a first domino. The architects of this madness were men like Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a brilliant strategist with a gambler's heart. The man who designed the Pearl Harbor attack wasn't blind to risk. He'd studied in the U.S., spoke English, and understood what America was capable of. He once said, "If I am told to fight, I shall run wild for 6 months. After that, I can promise nothing." He knew Japan could start a war. He wasn't sure they could finish it. But there were others in the room. Hawks, who believed destiny was on their side, that Japan was chosen by the gods to rule Asia, to humble the Western empires. They saw America as soft, too divided, too dependent on comfort to fight back. So they asked a question that no one dared to put on paper. What if we go all the way? In secret, the Imperial Navy began sketching out what they called Operation FS, the next phase after Pearl Harbor. The plan was to seize Hawaii, cut off Australia, and push eastward toward the U.S. mainland. In some circles, whispers went even further, of landing parties on the Pacific coast, raids on Los Angeles, even an occupation of San Francisco. Crazy maybe, but Japan had already pulled off the impossible once. Why stop dreaming now? Inside Japan's war councils, the debate grew heated. The army wanted China. The Navy wanted the Pacific. Both agreed on one thing. America couldn't be allowed to recover. If they hit hard enough, fast enough, they believed the U.S. public would break before its industry could rise. Remember, this was the same America still crawling out of the Great Depression. Factories weren't yet built for total war. Soldiers were still training with wooden rifles. On paper, Japan was right to think they had a window. But windows close fast when you underestimate a sleeping giant. The first crack in Japan's fantasy appeared the week after Pearl Harbor. Intelligence reports showed that the American aircraft carriers, the real targets of the attack, weren't in port that day. They'd escaped. That single fact haunted Yamamoto, because it meant that the U.S. still had its fangs. Yet the politicians in Tokyo ignored it. They wanted spectacle, not strategy. They told their people that America was finished, that the Pacific was theirs. And for a few months, it looked like they were right. Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, all fell like dominoes. The Japanese flag rose over half the Pacific. But Yamamoto knew something the others didn't. He'd seen America's shipyards. He'd seen Detroit. He knew how fast the U.S. could turn imagination into machinery. He told his peers, "We can run wild for 6 months." That was his prophecy. He was right, almost to the day. By mid-1942, Japan's victories began to slow. Logistics were stretched. Fuel was running thin. Every mile gained became harder to hold. But before those cracks widened, there was still a moment, a narrow, terrifying window, when the idea of invading America wasn't fantasy. It was strategy. Documents later found after the war showed that Japanese intelligence had even studied the defenses of America's west coast. They believed California could be hit with carrier-based aircraft, maybe even paratroopers. They knew the U.S. Army had barely enough men to protect its ports, and they had plans, real operational outlines, for what they called attacks on enemy territory. Think about that. While Americans were still reading newspaper headlines about Pearl Harbor, Japan was already imagining the next headline: Tokyo invades California. The invasion never came, but for a few short months, the world stood on the edge of a reality that would have rewritten history. A reality where the Pacific wasn't a moat, it was a highway. The question is, what stopped them? Because Japan had the will, the fleet, and the momentum. So what made them back off the unthinkable? Was it fear of American retaliation, lack of fuel, or something deeper, something inside the Japanese high command that cracked before the first boot ever touched American soil? And that's where this story turns dark, because the answer isn't just military, it's psychological. And it begins with one man who saw the future and tried to stop it. The man who saw the future was the same man who designed the past. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was no ordinary commander. He was a gambler, a scholar, a man who understood the mathematics of risk better than anyone in Tokyo. And deep down, he knew the cards were stacked against him. See, most of Japan's warlords lived in a fantasy, a nation of samurai pride and imperial destiny. They believed that spirit could overcome steel, and that sheer will could outmatch America's industry. But Yamamoto did studied at Harvard. He'd lived in Washington. He knew how Americans thought, how they built, how they fought, how they refused to quit once cornered. And when the whispers started, when the idea of a Japanese invasion of the U.S. mainland began echoing through military halls, Yamamoto didn't see glory. He saw suicide. Still, he couldn't just say it out loud, because in 1941 Japan, questioning the war machine was like questioning God. So he played the game differently. He nodded, smiled, and said the right things. But behind closed doors he was already plotting how to keep his own country from self-destruction. It started with intelligence, or what passed for it. Japan's spy network in America was thin, amateur, and riddled with false confidence. They didn't know about America's industrial surge or the massive oil fields inland. They had no idea the U.S. Navy could rebuild faster than anyone thought possible. All they saw was a west coast full of movie stars and farmland. They thought that meant weakness. So while Japan's generals dreamed of parading through San Francisco, Yamamoto started quietly asking the questions no one wanted to hear. How many ships will we have left after Hawaii? How do we supply troops across 5,000 miles of ocean? What happens when America's shipyards wake up? But the answers, when they came, chilled him. Because Japan didn't have a plan for that. They had vision, not logistics. Fire, not fuel. Inside the Imperial Navy, the divide grew ugly. On one side, men like Yamamoto, realists who'd seen the world. On the other, men like General Tojo and the nationalist hardliners, zealots who believed divine fate would fill the gaps left by missing ships and broken supply chains. It wasn't a strategy meeting anymore. It was a crusade. By early 1942, Japan had captured the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, even rolled into Burma. Victories came easy, too easy. Every headline fed the myth that the empire was unstoppable. And in that euphoria, the idea of striking America again, this time directly, came roaring back. There were two proposals. The first was Operation FS, the push east, to cut America off from its allies. The second was more dangerous, a plan whispered between naval officers to use submarines and aircraft carriers to shell U.S. coastal cities, spread panic, and force negotiations. A psychological invasion, they called it. Small raids meant to terrify the public into begging for peace. They imagined bombers over Los Angeles, submarine guns shelling San Diego, maybe even commandos sneaking ashore to sabotage refineries or docks. The line between fantasy and strategy blurred, but Yamamoto kept his composure. He understood dark psychology better than they did. He knew fear works both ways. If Japan terrified America, America wouldn't surrender. It would ignite. Still, he couldn't stop the tide. The military high command had tasted too much victory to slow down. So Yamamoto played his last card, logic. He warned them that the only way Japan could hold its empire was to destroy America's ability to fight, its carriers, its spirit, its hope. That meant luring them into one decisive battle, not an invasion, an ambush. And that's how the idea of Midway was born. And to the rest of the Navy, Midway looked like an opportunity, a trap to crush what was left of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. But to Yamamoto, it was something else. It was a controlled burn, a way to end the war quickly before Japan's leaders made the fatal mistake of taking the fight to American soil. If he could cripple the U.S. Navy again, this time for good, he believed Tokyo might sue for peace before the madness escalated. It was his silent rebellion, his hidden attempt to save his country from itself. But here's the tragic irony. The same brilliance that made Yamamoto a visionary also made him predictable. The Americans were reading his mail, cracking his codes, and preparing to turn his controlled burn into a full inferno. Because while Japan dreamed of invasion, the U.S. was already dreaming of vengeance. Factories roared to life. Women filled assembly lines. The same nation Japan thought was soft was now turning steel and anger into war machines. And by the time Yamamoto's fleet sailed toward Midway, the trap he thought he'd set was actually waiting for him. He wanted to stop the invasion before it began, but instead, he was about to light the fuse that would make it impossible. June 1942. The Pacific looked calm on the surface, but beneath that blue silence, two empires were gambling everything. Japan thought it was the hunter. America knew it was the bait. Yamamoto's grand plan, the one meant to end the war in a single stroke, was unfolding exactly as he'd designed it. A massive fleet stretched across the ocean, like a moving city. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, the pride of the Imperial Navy. Their goal was simple: lure the remaining American carriers to Midway Island, crush them, and eliminate America's ability to fight in the Pacific. In his mind, this was the final chapter before peace. But what he didn't know, what none of his admirals knew, was that their coded messages were no longer secret. The Americans had cracked Japan's naval encryption weeks earlier. Every move, every formation, every trap, Washington already knew. At Pearl Harbor, America had been blind. At Midway, Japan was across the ocean. Admiral Chester Nimitz was calm, methodical, and waiting. He knew the coordinates of Japan's approach, the timing of the attack, even the number of ships. He didn't need to guess. He just needed to be patient. When June 4th arrived, the ocean turned into a graveyard. Japanese bombers tore into Midway's defenses, confident the U.S. fleet was far away. But hidden beyond the horizon, three American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, were closing in. When they struck, they didn't just attack ships, they shattered Japan's illusion of invincibility. Within minutes, three of Japan's four carriers were burning. Massive steel giants turned into floating fireballs. Planes, pilots, fuel, gone. The fourth, Uluru, tried to fight back, landing a few brutal hits, even crippling the Yorktown. But by sunset, she too was gone. The Pacific that had once belonged to Japan now belonged to the flames. For Yamamoto, it was more than a military disaster. It was prophecy fulfilled. Exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, almost to the day, his window had closed. The loss of 4 carriers, hundreds of pilots, and irreplaceable equipment didn't just cripple Japan's navy, it ended the dream of domination, the dream of invasion, the dream of destiny. But here's the part history books rush past. It wasn't just ships that sank at Midway, it was belief. Back in Tokyo, the military high command tried to spin it. They called it a strategic setback. They told the press that Japan was still advancing elsewhere, still holding strong, but inside those halls, behind the polished uniforms and forced smiles, something broke. Yamamoto didn't speak for days. When he finally did, his words were quiet, haunted. It is not that I fear defeat. I fear that the war will go on when it should end. He knew what was coming, because Japan couldn't replace what it had lost. Those ships had taken years to build, and Japan didn't have the oil, steel, or manpower to rebuild them. America did. America could lose a carrier and build 3 more before the next spring. Midway was the turning point, not just of the war, but of the empire itself. From that moment on, Japan's grand plans shrank. The maps once covered in red arrows, pointing east toward Hawaii, California, the U.S. mainland, were erased. New maps showed defense lines, fallback zones, island fortresses. The mighty empire that once dreamed of invasion was now just fighting to hold what it had. Still, pride wouldn't let them say it out loud, so they created another illusion, one that would haunt the Pacific for the next 3 years. If they couldn't invade America, they would make America bleed to get to them. Every island, every beach, every inch of Pacific rock would become a fortress of death. But for Yamamoto, Midway marked the beginning of the end, both for the war and for him. In the months that followed, he became a ghost within his own command. He continued to lead, to plan, to issue orders, but the fire in his eyes was gone. He knew he had unleashed something he could no longer control, and in a cruel twist of fate, America knew exactly how to reach him. By 1943, U.S. intelligence wasn't just reading Japan's orders, they were tracking Yamamoto's movements in real time. His plane routes, inspection tours, radio messages, all of it decrypted. And one April morning, while he was flying over the Solomon Islands, the hunter became the hunted. American P-38 fighters intercepted his plane, shot it down, and left his body in the jungle. Yamamoto, the man who warned Japan not to start a war it couldn't finish, died exactly as he lived, carrying the weight of a nation's arrogance on his shoulders. But the real tragedy, his death didn't stop the madness, it only deepened it, because the men who replaced him didn't see Midway as a warning, they saw it as a challenge. And what Japan planned next wasn't an invasion of America's land, it was an invasion of America's mind. After Midway, Japan wasn't just losing ships, it was losing time. The empire had stretched itself too far, too fast. From the jungles of Burma to the beaches of Guadalcanal, its soldiers were fighting ghosts, enemies that always seemed to know where they'd be before they got there. The dream of conquest was rotting from the inside, and everyone in Tokyo could smell it. But pride is a hell of a drug, and for the Imperial High Command, surrender wasn't even in the dictionary. If Japan couldn't invade America by sea, then maybe, just maybe, it could invade her psyche. See, there's a part of this war few people talk about: the mind games, the propaganda, the desperation to make Americans fear the rising sun again. Because fear, even for a moment, can buy you time, and time was the one resource Japan didn't have. So as the Navy rebuilt what it could, Japan's scientists, engineers, and strategists turned to something else: innovation through madness. One of their strangest creations was called Operation Fugo, a name that sounds almost harmless, but its goal was chilling. Japan's meteorologists discovered that the jet stream, a high-speed current of wind, flowed from Asia straight to North America, so they built thousands of bomb-carrying balloons, designed to ride that invisible river all the way to the U.S. mainland. Think about that for a second. While American families were planting victory gardens and buying war bonds, Bombs were silently floating across the sky, thousands of miles away from the battlefields. Each balloon carried incendiary devices meant to ignite wildfires, destroy crops, and terrify civilians. It was the world's first intercontinental weapon, a desperate shot in the dark to make America feel the war it had only been watching from afar. Most of the balloons never made it. The ocean swallowed them, the wind scattered them, but a few did. Some landed in forests, some exploded harmlessly, and one killed a family in Oregon. May 1945, a group of kids and a pregnant woman were on a Sunday picnic when they found something strange in the woods. A large balloon tangled in trees. No one knew what it was. They walked closer, and in an instant the forest erupted. The explosion killed them all. It was the only direct enemy-inflicted casualty on U.S. soil during the entire war. Now think about that. Thousands dead at Pearl Harbor, millions across Europe and Asia, but only 6 civilians on American soil. For all Japan's ambition, all its engineering, that was the closest it ever got to invading the mainland. But here's where the story gets darker. The U.S. government covered it up. News outlets were ordered not to report the balloon attacks, not the explosions, not the fires, not even the deaths. Why? Because Washington feared panic. The goal wasn't to protect the public, it was to protect morale. If Americans thought the homeland was vulnerable, the illusion of safety would crumble. So the people who died in that forest, their story disappeared under national security memos and classified reports. They didn't get their names in textbooks, they just got forgotten. And while the Fugo balloons failed to change the course of the war, they proved something Japan had been hoping for all along, that America wasn't untouchable, that even a dying empire could reach across the ocean and make her flinch. But Tokyo wasn't satisfied. If balloons couldn't bring America to its knees, maybe something else could. So began a new wave of planning. Desperate, dangerous, and utterly delusional. Ideas for submarine raids on California, kamikaze attacks on Panama, biological weapons launched at San Diego, each one more unhinged than the last. Yamamoto had once warned that waking the American giant would lead to destruction. Now his successors were trying to claw at that giant's face before the inevitable stomp. The plans never made it far. Too little fuel, too few ships, too many broken men trying to build miracles from scraps. But the intent was real. Japan still dreamed, even in its death spiral, of a moment that would make the world gasp again. And yet, in one hidden laboratory outside Tokyo, there was an idea, one last, terrifying vision of revenge that made even Japan's most loyal generals hesitate. Because if it had worked, America wouldn't have just been scared, it would have been scarred forever. By late 1944, Japan was no longer fighting to win, it was fighting to hurt. Factories lay in ruins. Cities burned under American bombers that turned night into fire. The Navy was shattered. The skies belonged to the enemy. And yet, somewhere deep inside the Imperial war machine, there were still men whispering the same question. If we can't defeat America, can we infect her? That question gave birth to something so dark. Most of the documents were destroyed before the war even ended, but some survived. And what they reveal is terrifying. The project was called Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night. It was to be Japan's final revenge, a biological attack on the U.S. mainland, designed to unleash death itself. The plan came from Unit 731, Japan's most secret and sadistic military division. Officially, it was a research unit. In reality, it was a laboratory of horrors, a place where science and sadism merged. Located in occupied Manchuria, its commander, General Shurto Ishii, believed he had discovered the future of warfare. Ishii and his men weren't content with bullets or bombs. They experimented on living prisoners, Chinese civilians, captured soldiers, even children. They infected them with plague, anthrax, cholera. They dissected them alive to study the results. To them, human suffering wasn't tragedy, it was data, and Ishii wanted to bring that data to America. His plan was as ambitious as it was monstrous. Japanese submarines would sail across the Pacific to the west coast, to San Diego. On board would be aircraft equipped with plague-infected fleas, carried in ceramic bombs. The planes would launch at night, flying low to avoid radar, and release their deadly cargo over the city. Imagine it. Not an explosion, not flames or smoke, just silence, followed by fever, swelling, death. The goal wasn't destruction, it was panic, a silent epidemic that would make America look inward, that would make her fear her own streets more than Japan's armies. Even within the Japanese high command, there was hesitation. Some argued it was dishonorable. Others said it was pointless, that America's retaliation would wipe Japan off the map. But Ishii didn't care. He was convinced his plague bombs would make him immortal in the annals of war. He called it the divine wind of germs, and the date was set, September 22, 1945. But fate had other plans, because on August 6, 1945, before Ishii's nightmare could take flight, the world changed forever. The sky over Hiroshima turned white. The first atomic bomb fell. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. In an instant, Japan's entire concept of warfare, of revenge, of survival, was obliterated. There would be no biological counterattack, no dark triumph of science. The empire that dreamed of plague now faced an enemy that wielded the power of the sun. When the emperor announced Japan's surrender on August 15th, Operation Cherry Blossoms at night died with it. The submarines never sailed. The aircraft were never loaded. The plague bombs remained locked in crates that would never open. But the story doesn't end there. When American occupation forces entered Japan, they discovered Ishii's laboratories, his data, his surviving staff. What they found was too horrifying to comprehend. Jars filled with organs, records of human experimentation so detailed it made even hardened soldiers sick. And here's the part that history books often whisper about but rarely shout. The United States didn't execute Ishii. Instead, he was given immunity. In exchange for his research, the same man who designed a plan to infect American civilians was quietly handed a deal, because Washington wanted to understand what he had learned about biological warfare. His findings were smuggled into U.S. military archives, buried under classified projects that would one day help shape America's own biological weapons program. Justice was never served. The victims of Unit 731 were never mourned. And Shiro Ishii, he lived a long life, died peacefully in his bed in 1959. Operation Cherry Blossoms at night was never executed, but its shadow lingered. It stood as proof that desperation can twist even the most disciplined armies into monsters. Japan's invasion of America was never meant to be an army storming the beaches. It was meant to be a disease, invisible, unstoppable, and merciless. But in the end, Japan never infected America. It only infected itself, with delusion, denial, and death. By the time Japan surrendered, the Pacific was more than just an ocean. It was a graveyard. The empire that once stretched from China to the Solomon Islands had shrunk to ashes and shame. Cities burned, families starved, the rising sun had set, and the men who once dreamed of conquering the world now faced the silence of defeat, the kind that doesn't come from bombs, but from the collapse of belief itself. For years, Japan's generals had preached divinity, that their nation was chosen, that their emperor was a god, that dying for him was the highest honor. But as the mushroom clouds rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that divine armor cracked. For the first time, even the most loyal officers began to whisper, "If we were chosen by heaven, why did heaven abandon us?" Inside Tokyo's Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito made a decision no emperor before him had ever made. He broke the silence. He spoke to his people directly, his voice trembling through radio static, and said the unthinkable. Japan must endure the unendurable. Those words didn't just end a war, they ended an illusion. The empire that had once planned to invade America, to humble a continent, now bowed to it. But here's the twist. History often buries under the rubble. Surrender didn't end Japan's secret war. It just changed its form. Because the Americans didn't just want victory, They wanted knowledge. When U.S. occupation forces entered the ruins of Manchuria and Japan, they found crates of documents, strange laboratories, and men who had been ghosts to the world. Men like General Shiro Ishii, the mastermind behind Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night. His unit, 731, had killed thousands in experiments, so cruel they defied comprehension. The Americans could have hanged him. The Soviets wanted to, but Washington saw something else. Value. They granted Ishii and his top scientists full immunity. In return, they handed over every scrap of data they'd gathered on frostbite, disease, human endurance, and death itself. That research soaked in blood would quietly shape America's early biological weapons program. So while Japan's empire burned, its science lived on, reborn under a new flag. Ask yourself, who really won? The truth is, by the end of 1945, both nations had become reflections of each other's nightmares. Japan had built the blueprint for total war. America had perfected it. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just victories, they were warnings, proof that the line between defense and annihilation had vanished. The Japanese invasion of America never happened, but in another way it did, because the fear it created, the paranoia that an enemy could reach across oceans and strike unseen, became the foundation of America's Cold War psychology. From that fear came radar networks, nuclear stockpiles, spy agencies. The dream of the Pacific Empire died, but its ghost haunted the future. And yet, buried beneath all the rubble and silence, there was something else. A lesson. That arrogance, no matter what flag it flies under, always ends the same way. Japan believed its divine destiny made it unstoppable. America believed its moral superiority made its power righteous. Both learned that technology doesn't make you God, it just makes your sins bigger. In the decades that followed, Japan rebuilt, not through conquest, but through craft, through humility, through work. The same nation that once plotted to infect San Diego with plague, now exported cars, cameras, and culture. The sword became the circuit board. The empire became an economy. But for the men who survived the war, on both sides, the ghosts never left. The soldiers who buried their friends on volcanic beaches, the civilians who watched cities vanish into smoke, the scientists who traded ethics for survival. History doesn't forget them. It just whispers their names under the noise of progress. And that's what makes Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night so haunting. It was more than a plan. It was a mirror, a reflection of what desperation turns men into when defeat isn't an option. And maybe that's why it never launched. Because deep down, even the empire built on obedience had a moment of clarity, a realization that some weapons, once unleashed, can never be controlled. In the end, Japan didn't invade America with ships or germs. It invaded itself and lost. The war that was supposed to define a millennium ended in 6 years, and the men who dreamed of glory ended as footnotes to a nightmare. But history has a strange sense of irony, because the one thing Japan wanted to be remembered, it achieved, not for conquest, but for caution. When you hear of Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, it's not just a story about what almost happened, it's a warning about what always happens when power and pride go unchecked. And that's the real invasion, not across borders, but across conscience.